Somewhere in the frozen edges of the world, a testimony exists that most people have never heard of. It sits in the margins of historical records, quietly separated from the main account that the world came to accept. It was given by someone who was actually present, someone who traveled into those conditions, witnessed what happened, and later described it in their own words. And when you place those words next to the official version of events, something does not sit right. This is not a dramatic contradiction. It is not an obvious or loudly stated disagreement. It is something quieter than that, and in some ways, more difficult to dismiss. The testimony describes events, conditions, and decisions in ways that simply do not match what the official record says. The differences are specific enough to notice, and persistent enough to raise questions that have never been fully answered. The person who gave this testimony was not an outsider. They were not someone commenting from a distance or reconstructing events from second-hand information. They were there. They experienced the cold, the travel, the decisions made under pressure, and the outcomes that followed. Their account is a first-hand description of what they personally observed during a polar expedition that has since become part of established historical record. And yet, their testimony was never placed at the center of that record. It was not included in the formal submissions. It was not quoted in the official reports. For years, it existed somewhere outside the main story, present, but not acknowledged, noticed by very few, and followed up on by even fewer. This raises a simple but genuinely uncomfortable question. When two accounts of the same events exist, and one of them comes directly from someone who was present, how do we decide which version to trust? The official report carries the weight of institutional authority. It was reviewed, approved, and entered into the historical record. It has been repeated in textbooks, referenced in documentaries, and treated as the accepted version of what happened. That repetition, over time, gives it a kind of permanence that is hard to question. But repetition is not the same as accuracy. A version of events can be repeated many times and still be incomplete. It can be reviewed and approved and still reflect only the perspective of those who held authority over the reporting process. That is not a radical idea. It is simply how records work. The people who control what gets written down also control, to a significant degree, what gets remembered. The official story of this expedition has been treated as settled fact for a long time. It describes conditions, movements, decisions, and outcomes in a way that has become standard. Researchers reference it. Historians build on it. It forms the foundation of how this particular chapter of polar exploration is understood. That foundation has not been seriously questioned in most mainstream discussions of the subject. But this testimony suggests the foundation may not be as solid as it appears. Not because the official story is entirely wrong, but because it may be telling only part of what actually happened. It may be presenting a version of events that was shaped, whether deliberately or not, by the priorities of those who had the most to gain from a particular kind of narrative. What makes this testimony especially worth examining is not only what it says. Many historical accounts contain discrepancies. Many witnesses describe things differently from official reports. That alone is not unusual. What is unusual here is what happened to this testimony afterward. Or rather, what did not happen to it? It was overlooked. For an extended period of time, it was not discussed in any serious or sustained way. Researchers who came across it did not follow up. Those who might have compared it carefully to the official record chose, for whatever reason, not to pursue that comparison in any public or formal way. The testimony existed, but it existed in a kind of quiet isolation, separated from the conversation that surrounded the events it described. That silence is itself something worth examining. When a direct witness account contradicts an official record, the expected response is engagement. Questions are asked. The account is investigated. It is either explained, integrated, or formally challenged. That process did not happen here in any visible way. The testimony was simply not part of the conversation, and that absence of engagement is harder to explain than the discrepancies themselves. Some researchers who have looked at this material suggest that the omission was a product of its time. Official expedition records from this era were controlled by expedition leaders and the institutions that backed them. Junior members, support personnel, and anyone without formal authority over the documentation process had limited ability to ensure their accounts were included. If a testimony was inconvenient, the simplest response was not to suppress it dramatically, but simply to not include it. No formal rejection, no noted disagreement, just a quiet absence. That explanation has a certain logic to it. The period in question was one in which polar expeditions carried enormous prestige. They were national and institutional projects. The way they were reported reflected on the organizations and governments that had invested in them. An account that introduced complications or suggested problems with leadership or decision-making was not the kind of material that easily found its way into formal submissions. That is not speculation about this case specifically. That is a documented pattern across polar expedition history more broadly. But even within that context, certain aspects of this particular testimony remain difficult to account for. It is one thing to omit a general expression of dissatisfaction or a vague sense that things were harder than reported. It is another thing entirely to omit an account that differs from the official record on specific, verifiable details, specific locations, specific dates, specific decisions. Those are not the kinds of differences that can be explained by mood or perspective alone. And those are exactly the kinds of differences this testimony contains. The discrepancies are not sweeping or vague. They are focused. They appear at particular points in the narrative where precise details matter, where a supply situation is described, where a decision is recorded, where the condition of a critical resource is noted. These are not minor points. In the context of a polar expedition, these details are central to understanding what happened and why. At first, this may seem like a historical puzzle with limited relevance. Events from this era are distant. The people involved are no longer living. Whatever happened in those frozen conditions has long since become part of a fixed past that cannot be changed. But the question of how that past was recorded and whether the recording was accurate remains a live question, because the record that was produced is the basis for how the event is understood, discussed, and taught. If the record is incomplete or selectively constructed, then so is the understanding built on top of it. There is also something worth considering in the very nature of polar testimony. Expeditions into extreme environments produced accounts of extraordinary human experience. The conditions demanded clarity. The stakes were high enough that details mattered in ways they might not in ordinary circumstances. A witness who described those conditions was not speculating about abstract events. They were describing things that directly affected survival. That context gives polar testimony a certain weight. When someone in those conditions said a supply cache was not intact, they were not making a casual observation. They were recording something that mattered deeply to everyone present. And that is precisely what makes the silence around this particular testimony so difficult to dismiss. The person who gave this account was describing events that carried real consequence. Their description of those events differs from what was officially recorded, and instead of being addressed, compared, or explained, their account was simply left out of the conversation for a very long time. Some who have reviewed this material suggest that the testimony may contain errors of its own. Memory is not a perfect recorder. Time changes the way events are recalled. A witness may be entirely sincere and still describe something differently from how it actually occurred. That possibility cannot be ruled out, but it must be weighed against the specificity of the account. Very specific details are harder to attribute to simple memory drift than general impressions are. Others suggest that the testimony and the official report may simply reflect different vantage points within the same expedition. Someone in a senior position and someone in a junior position may have had access to different information. What one person observed may not have been visible to another. Under this view, the discrepancies are not evidence of inaccuracy on either side, but of the natural limits of individual perspective. That interpretation has merit, but it also has limits. There are points in the testimony where the account does not simply add a different perspective to the official record. It directly contradicts it. Two accounts of the same specific event, describing that event in incompatible ways, cannot both be fully accurate at the same time. At least one of them contains something that did not happen the way it was described. And that is the point where the silence becomes most significant, because no one has formally worked through which account is correct in those specific contradictions. No comparative analysis has been published. No formal review of the discrepancies has been placed in front of the historical community in any lasting way. The testimony has been noted by a small number of researchers and then, once again, set aside. The question of why that keeps happening is one that does not have a clear answer. It may reflect a simple lack of resources or institutional interest. Historical investigation takes time, access, and funding, and not every anomaly receives the attention it might deserve. It may reflect a reluctance to complicate a well-established narrative without overwhelming evidence that the complication is necessary. Or it may reflect something about how certain kinds of testimony are valued, whose voices are treated as authoritative and whose are quietly left at the margins. What can be said with reasonable certainty is this: a testimony exists. It was given by someone who was present at events that are part of the official historical record. It describes those events in ways that conflict with that record on specific and meaningful points. It was not included in the formal account. It was not addressed in any sustained or public way for a long time. And the questions it raises about what actually happened, about how the record was constructed, and about why this particular account was left out, have not been satisfactorily answered. That is not a conclusion. It is an observation, and it is the kind of observation that, once made, is difficult to set aside, because somewhere in the frozen edges of the world, this testimony still exists. Quiet, specific, and just different enough from the accepted story to keep asking a question that has never been fully answered. To understand why this testimony matters, it is necessary to first look carefully at what the official story actually says, not in general terms, but in its specific structure and logic, because before any question can be raised about whether the record is accurate, the record itself needs to be understood clearly, and the official account of this expedition, on the surface, appears reasonable, organized, and complete. Polar expeditions of the early 20th century were not casual ventures. They required months or years of planning. They involved significant financial investment from governments, geographic societies, and private sponsors. The teams that set out were composed of experienced individuals with specific roles and responsibilities. Navigation, science, logistics, medicine. Each area was assigned to someone with relevant knowledge. These were serious undertakings, and they were treated as such by the institutions that backed them. Documentation was a central part of that seriousness. Expedition leaders were expected to keep detailed records throughout the journey. Daily logs were maintained. Weather conditions were noted. Routes were tracked. Supply levels were recorded. Significant decisions were written down, along with the reasoning behind them. This documentation was not optional. It was considered part of the expedition's obligation to the organizations and governments that had provided support. When an expedition returned, those records were reviewed and compiled. A formal report was produced. That report was submitted to the relevant authorities, geographic societies, naval offices, government bodies. Depending on the nature of the expedition, the report then became the official account. It was the version of events that entered the public record. It was published, distributed, and in many cases became the basis for books, articles, and later historical assessments. The official version of this particular expedition follows that structure. It describes a team that set out with clear objectives. The route was planned in advance. The team followed that route according to the established timeline, with adjustments made where conditions required. The report describes the environment as challenging but consistent with what experienced polar travelers would expect. Difficult, certainly, but not outside the range of what had been encountered and managed before. Decisions made during the expedition are described in the official account as rational and appropriate. When conditions required a change in plan, those changes are presented as measured responses to circumstances. When difficulties arose, they are documented as problems that were identified and addressed according to standard practice. The picture that emerges from the official report is one of a competent team managing a demanding environment with reasonable effectiveness. The outcomes of the expedition, including the difficult ones, are explained in the official account through the language of natural conditions. The environment was extreme. Polar travel carries inherent risks. Some of what happened was a consequence of those risks. That framing is not unusual for expedition reports of this period. It was the standard way of contextualizing outcomes that might otherwise raise questions about planning, leadership, or decision-making. This version of events was accepted by the relevant authorities when it was submitted. The senior members of the expedition provided accounts that supported the official report. Their descriptions aligned with the picture presented in the formal documentation. The report was reviewed, approved, and entered into the record. Over time, as it was referenced and repeated, it became the foundation for how this expedition was understood. That foundation has remained largely undisturbed in mainstream historical discussion. The report sits in archives, where it can be consulted by researchers. It is cited in academic work. It informs how the expedition is described in educational materials. For most people who have any knowledge of this event at all, the official account is the only account they have ever encountered. There is no widely known alternative. The story, as it is usually told, begins and ends with the official version. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the official account, for all its apparent completeness, was not built from every available voice. The report that was submitted, reviewed, and accepted did not include all the accounts of everyone who was present. And that gap between who was there and whose testimony was included is where the first question appears. The testimony in question came from someone who was part of the expedition, but not part of its leadership structure. This was someone positioned lower in the hierarchy, not a senior officer, not someone with formal authority over the documentation process, someone whose role placed them in the middle of events, but outside the circle of those who controlled how those events were officially described. That position matters. In the expedition structure of this era, the flow of information ran through specific channels. Observations made by junior members were sometimes reported up to senior personnel, sometimes recorded in personal notes, and sometimes simply retained in memory. They were not automatically included in formal submissions. The decision about what went into the official report rested almost entirely with those at the top of the expedition hierarchy. Under that system, it was entirely possible for a credible, detailed account from someone who had been present throughout the expedition to be excluded from the formal record, not necessarily through any deliberate act of suppression, but simply because the person who held authority over the reporting process did not include it. No explanation required, no note acknowledging the omission, just an absence. That is precisely what appears to have happened here. The testimony exists. The person who gave it was present, and yet their account is not in the official submission. There is no reference to it in the formal record. There is no note indicating that it was reviewed and set aside. It simply does not appear, and that absence is gone without formal explanation for a very long time. At first, this might seem like a procedural matter with limited significance. Expedition reports of this era routinely reflected the perspective of senior members. Junior voices were frequently absent from formal documentation. In that context, the omission of one account from one individual might appear to be simply how things worked at the time. Nothing more complicated than that. But there's a problem with that explanation. It does not account for what the testimony actually contains. The argument that junior voices were routinely excluded might explain why a general impression or a personal reflection was left out. It does not easily explain why a specific account that differs from the official record on particular factual points was left out without any acknowledgement of that difference. If the testimony had simply described the same events in a similar way, with perhaps a different emotional tone or a different level of personal detail, its absence from the official record would be easy to explain. It would add nothing that was not already there. But that is not what the testimony does. It describes certain events differently, and that difference, in specific and identifiable ways, was never addressed in the official documentation. That is not a small thing. When one account of an event says one thing, and another account of the same event says something different, the standard expectation is that the difference gets examined. It gets noted, compared, explained, or resolved. That process does not appear to have happened here. The discrepancy was not acknowledged. It was not addressed. It was simply left unexamined, alongside the testimony itself, outside the official record. Some researchers who have spent time with this material suggest that the exclusion may reflect something about how authority and credibility were assigned within expedition culture at the time. Senior members were considered reliable sources. Their accounts were given weight. Junior members occupied a different position in that system. Their observations were not automatically treated with the same level of trust, regardless of how directly they had witnessed the events they were describing. If that dynamic was at work here, it raises its own questions. A system that assigns credibility based on rank rather than proximity to events may produce records that reflect hierarchy more accurately than they reflect reality. In that kind of system, the person with the most authority over the reporting process also has the most influence over what the historical record looks like. And the people closest to certain events, but furthest from authority, may find that their observations do not survive into the formal account. There is no way to confirm that this is what happened in this specific case. The motivations of those who compiled the official report are not available for direct examination. What can be examined is the result. The testimony exists. The official record exists. The two do not fully align on specific points. And the testimony was not included in the formal submission, with no recorded explanation for its absence. That combination of facts is what gives this case its particular character. It is not simply a matter of two people remembering the same event differently. It is a matter of one account being given official status while another was set aside, and the process by which that happened remaining opaque. The official story became the record, and the record became the truth, in the way that repeated, institutionally endorsed versions of events tend to become the truth over time. What sits at the edge of that truth, still unexamined, is this testimony, given by someone who was present, containing details that differ from the official account, excluded from the formal record without explanation, and left, for a very long time, in a kind of historical silence that has never been fully accounted for. Understanding the official story clearly is the necessary first step, because it is only when the official account is understood in its structure and its logic that the gaps within it become visible. And one of those gaps is the absence of this testimony, not just as a different perspective, but as a direct account from someone who was there, describing specific events in ways that the official record does not reflect. The official story is not obviously wrong. It is not full of visible holes or obvious contradictions on its surface. It is a well-constructed account that has held its place in the historical record for a long time. But well-constructed accounts can still be incomplete. They can still leave out voices that would complicate the picture. And the question of whether this particular account left out something important, deliberately or otherwise, is one that the official record, by its own silence on the matter, does not answer. Here is where the first real problem appears. Not a vague inconsistency or a general feeling that something is off. A specific, identifiable problem that sits at the center of how this testimony was handled. And once it is clearly stated, it becomes difficult to move past without asking some uncomfortable questions about the official record and how it was constructed. Polar expedition records were not produced casually. There was a process, a structure. When a team returned from the field, information was gathered through an organized system. The expedition leader, or a designated officer assigned to that responsibility, would collect accounts from members of the team. These accounts would be reviewed, compiled, and shaped into the formal report that was eventually submitted to the relevant authorities. That process was considered standard practice. It was how polar documentation worked during this period. Within that process, not every account was treated equally. Testimonies from senior officers carried the most weight. They were the voices most likely to be quoted directly, referenced specifically, and given prominence in the final submission. Accounts from crew members, support staff, and junior personnel occupied a different category. They were sometimes included in full, sometimes summarized briefly, sometimes mentioned in passing, and sometimes left out entirely, with no record of their existence in the formal documentation at all. That last outcome, complete omission with no record, is what happened here. The testimony in question was not included in the official submission. It was not summarized. It was not mentioned as a source that was reviewed and set aside. It simply does not appear in the formal record in any form. For someone who was present throughout the expedition, across most of the key events that the official account describes, that is an unusual absence. And this is where it becomes unclear, because the standard explanation for why a junior account might be left out, that it added nothing new, that it simply echoed what senior members had already reported, does not apply cleanly in this case. That explanation works when the absent account would have been redundant. It does not work when the absent account contains information that differs from what was officially submitted. The individual who gave this testimony was not absent from the events described in the official record. That point deserves careful attention. They were not stationed at a different location when the critical events occurred. They were not incapacitated by illness or injury during the periods that matter most to the official account. They were present. They were observing, and they later described what they observed in specific terms that can be compared, point by point, against the formal report. That comparison is where the difficulty begins, because when those two accounts are placed side by side, certain details do not match. Not in the way that two people might describe the same scene with different emotional emphasis. In the way that two people are describing specific facts differently. Conditions, decisions, sequences of events. These are described in ways that cannot both be accurate at the same time. One account says one thing, the other says something else, and the two cannot be fully reconciled. This raises a question that the official record does not answer. Was the testimony reviewed by those responsible for compiling the report, and then deliberately set aside? Or did it never reach the reviewing authority at all? These are two very different situations. In the first case, someone looked at the testimony, recognized that it contained material inconsistent with the official version, and chose not to include it. In the second case, the testimony was simply never part of the formal review process, for reasons that are not documented anywhere. Either possibility is worth thinking about carefully. If the testimony was reviewed and excluded, then the people responsible for the official report were aware of a conflicting account and chose not to address it. That would raise questions about the integrity of the reporting process. If the testimony was never submitted to the reviewing authority, then it was filtered out at an earlier stage before it could even be considered. That would raise a different set of questions about how information was controlled within the expedition structure. The official report does not clarify which of these situations occurred. There is no note in the formal documentation that acknowledges the individual's account. There is no reference to their perspective being considered. There is no explanation of why someone who was present for the events being described was not included as a source. The report simply proceeds as though this person's observations do not exist. At first, that might seem like a minor administrative gap. Record-keeping from this era was not always complete. Omissions happened for practical reasons. Not everything that existed in informal or personal form made it into formal institutional documentation. That is a reasonable observation about historical record-keeping in general. But there is a problem with applying that general observation to this specific case. The omission here is not of a vague personal impression or a general sense of how the expedition felt. It is the omission of specific factual claims that contradict specific factual claims in the official record. That is a different category of absence, and that difference matters. Some researchers who have spent time examining the archives around this expedition have proposed that the omission was procedural. Under this view, the testimony simply did not pass through the channels that would have brought it to the attention of those compiling the formal report. It was not a matter of anyone choosing to exclude it. It was a matter of the system not capturing it. The process had gaps, and this account fell through one of them. That explanation is not impossible. Procedural gaps are real. Systems fail to capture things they should capture. But the procedural explanation becomes harder to maintain when the content of the testimony is examined. Because if the testimony had been captured, if it had reached the people responsible for the official report, its contents would have created a problem. It would have introduced contradictions that needed to be addressed. The easier path, under those circumstances, might have been to not capture it at all. Others who have reviewed this material take a more direct position. They point out that the discrepancies between the testimony and the official account are not minor. They are not differences of interpretation or emphasis. They are factual disagreements about specific events and conditions, and a factual disagreement of that kind between a witness present at the events and the official record of those events is not something that can be dismissed as a procedural oversight. This is where the explanation becomes genuinely difficult. Procedural explanations work for gaps. They do not work as well for contradictions. A gap means something is missing from the record. A contradiction means two things exist that cannot both be true. And the situation here is not simply that the testimony is absent from the official record. It is that the testimony, where it can be compared to the official record, says something different. That is not a gap. That is a disagreement. And that disagreement has never been formally examined. No published analysis has placed the two accounts side by side and worked through the specific points of conflict. No institutional review has acknowledged the discrepancy and offered an explanation for it. The official record has continued to stand as the accepted version of events, and the testimony has continued to exist outside that record, without the relationship between the two ever being formally addressed. That silence around the disagreement is perhaps the most significant aspect of the situation. In historical research, when two accounts of the same events conflict, the standard response is investigation. The accounts are compared. The points of difference are identified. Possible explanations are considered. A conclusion may or may not be reached, but the process of examination is considered necessary. That process does not appear to have happened here in any sustained or public way. Why that examination has not taken place is itself a question without a clear answer. It may reflect limited access to the testimony in accessible archives. It may reflect a general tendency to treat well-established records as settled and not in need of revisiting. It may reflect something about how certain kinds of sources are evaluated, which accounts are considered credible enough to be placed in productive tension with official documentation, and which are not. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. A testimony from someone who was present at these events describes them differently from the official record. That testimony was not included in the formal documentation. No explanation for its absence has been provided, and the factual disagreement between the two accounts has not been formally addressed in any way that has entered the historical record. That is not a comfortable situation for anyone who takes historical accuracy seriously, because the official account, which has shaped how this expedition is understood and remembered, was constructed without this voice. Whether that omission changed the picture significantly, or only in certain details, is exactly the kind of question that cannot be answered until the comparison is made carefully and honestly. The first problem, then, is not simply that a testimony was left out. The first problem is that a testimony was left out. It contains specific information that differs from the official account, and no one has formally explained why either of those things is the case. That combination of facts does not resolve itself through general observations about how expedition records were kept. It requires a more specific accounting, and that accounting, so far, has not arrived. What remains is the testimony itself, sitting outside the official record, specific in its claims, present in the archives for those who look carefully enough to find it, and unaddressed by the institutions and researchers whose job it is to ensure that the historical record reflects, as accurately as possible, what actually happened. That gap between what the record contains and what it may have left out is where the real investigation has to begin. To understand how this situation developed, it helps to step back from the testimony itself for a moment and look at the wider context in which it was produced. Because the question of why a witness account might be excluded from an official expedition record is not a simple one. It cannot be answered by looking only at this case. It requires understanding the environment in which polar expeditions operated, how they were funded, what they meant to the people and institutions behind them, and how that meaning shaped the way their stories were told. That distinction matters considerably. A junior member saying the journey was more exhausting than the report suggested is a difference of tone. A junior member saying a specific decision was made differently from how it is described in the official record is a difference of fact. The first kind of discrepancy is interesting, but not necessarily alarming. The second kind requires a more careful response, because two contradictory factual claims about the same event cannot both be accurate. The testimony in question contains the second kind of discrepancy, and that is what places it in a more significant category than simply an alternative perspective or a more personal account of the same journey. It is making specific claims that conflict with specific claims in the official record, and those conflicts have not been examined and resolved in any documented way. Some researchers who have studied polar expedition history more broadly suggest that this type of discrepancy was not unusual in structural terms. The conditions that produced it, the concentration of authority over documentation in the hands of senior personnel, the institutional pressure to present successful or manageable outcomes, the limited formal channels through which junior voices could reach the official record, were common features of expedition organization during this era. They created a situation in which conflicting accounts were systematically unlikely to surface in formal documentation. Under that structural view, the absence of this testimony from the official record is not surprising. It fits a pattern. The system was not designed to surface conflicting accounts. It was designed to produce a coherent, authoritative version of events that could be submitted to institutional backers and made available to the public. Anything that complicated that version had limited pathways into the formal record. That structural explanation has a certain explanatory power. It helps account for how this situation developed without requiring a specific act of deliberate concealment. The system itself created conditions in which certain kinds of information were unlikely to be included, and this testimony was the kind of information the system was not designed to capture. However, the structural explanation does not fully resolve the problem, because the testimony does not merely represent information the system failed to capture. It represents information that, if accurate, would directly challenge the factual accuracy of the official account, and that raises a question the structural explanation cannot answer on its own. If the people responsible for the official record had encountered this testimony, would they have been obligated to address the contradictions it contained? And if so, why does no evidence of that process exist? This is where the explanation becomes difficult. The structural argument explains why junior voices were routinely absent from official records. It does not explain why a specific factual disagreement with the official record was never formally acknowledged or examined. Those are two different problems. The first is a systemic one. The second is a specific one. And the specific problem, in this case, remains unresolved. The broader historical pattern provides context. It confirms that this kind of situation was not unique to this expedition or this testimony. It shows that the conditions which allowed such discrepancies to develop were present across polar exploration more generally. That context is useful for understanding how the situation came to exist. But context is not the same as explanation. Knowing that a pattern existed does not explain why this particular instance of that pattern has never been formally examined. What the broader context does make clear is that the testimony fits within a recognizable category of historical material. Accounts given by people present at significant events, whose observations differed from the official record, and whose voices did not survive into formal documentation in any usable form. Some of those accounts have later been examined carefully and found to change how certain events are understood. Others remain in the margins, unexamined. Their relationship to the official record never fully worked out. This testimony belongs, at present, to the second group. It exists. Its contents are specific. The contradictions it contains with the official record are identifiable, and the broader historical pattern within which it sits confirms that the conditions for exactly this kind of discrepancy were present during this period of polar exploration. But the specific question of what these contradictions mean for the accuracy of the official account remains open. That is not a comfortable place to leave things, but it may be where the honest examination of this material currently stands. The context has been established. The pattern has been identified. The structural conditions that allowed this situation to develop are reasonably well understood. What has not been done, and what the historical record, in its current form, does not provide, is a careful, direct accounting of the specific factual disagreements between this testimony and the official version of events. That work has not been completed, and until it is, the testimony will continue to sit where it has always sat, outside the official record, specific in its claims, and unresolved in its relationship to the story that history has chosen to tell. When you sit with both documents and read them carefully, something begins to happen. The differences do not announce themselves immediately. They do not leap off the page in the first few lines. They emerge gradually, as you move through section after section, comparing one account against the other. And what makes them worth paying attention to is not their size. It is their consistency. They keep appearing, in different parts of the account, across different types of information, The same pattern of divergence shows up again and again. That persistence is what separates these inconsistencies from ordinary variation between two accounts of the same events. It is normal for two people to describe the same situation with different emphasis or different emotional weight. It is normal for details that feel significant to one person to go unmentioned by another. That kind of variation is expected and does not, by itself, indicate a problem with either account. But when specific factual claims appear in one document and are contradicted by specific factual claims in another, across multiple points of comparison, the explanation of ordinary variation begins to lose its strength. The first inconsistency worth examining closely involves a decision, not a minor logistical detail, but a significant choice made at a critical point in the expedition, the kind of decision that, in polar travel, carries real consequences for what follows. The official report describes this decision as unanimous. Every member of the team, according to the formal record, was in agreement. The choice was made collectively. There was no division, no objection, no internal debate recorded anywhere in the submitted documentation. The testimony describes the same decision very differently. According to the witness, the decision was not unanimous. There was disagreement within the team. Some members raised objections. Those objections were not resolved through discussion that brought everyone into agreement. Instead, the final choice was made by a small group of senior personnel, and it was implemented despite the reservations of others who were present. The witness describes this clearly and with enough specific detail that it does not read like a vague general impression. At first, this might seem like a minor difference. One account says everyone agreed. Another says not everyone agreed. Perhaps, it could be argued, the disagreement was minor enough that the expedition leader did not consider it worth documenting. Perhaps what the testimony describes as objections were really just questions or expressions of uncertainty that were quickly resolved. That interpretation is possible. It cannot be ruled out. But there is a problem with accepting that interpretation too quickly. In polar expedition history, the question of whether key decisions were genuinely collective or effectively imposed by senior personnel has proven to be highly significant. There are well-documented cases where the contested nature of a decision was directly connected to how that decision played out in practice. When team members have reservations about a course of action, and those reservations are overridden, the commitment to executing that action may be different from what it would have been with genuine consensus. In extreme environments, that difference matters. This is why the distinction between a unanimous decision and a contested one is not a minor editorial point. It is potentially a meaningful part of understanding why certain outcomes occurred. If the decision described in the official record as unanimous was actually contested, then the account of what followed that decision may also need to be understood differently. The official framing of events as the natural result of a collectively agreed course of action looks different when the agreement itself is called into question. The testimony does not simply say the decision felt difficult or that the atmosphere was tense. It describes the mechanics of the disagreement, who objected, how the final choice was reached. That level of specificity suggests the witness was not reconstructing a general mood from memory. They were describing something they directly observed, and what they observed differs clearly from what the official record states happened. Then there is the question of the timeline. This is the second category of inconsistency, and in some ways it is harder to explain than the disagreement over the decision. The official report presents events in a particular sequence. Certain things happen on certain dates, in a certain order. That sequence is stated clearly in the formal documentation. It forms the structural backbone of the official account. The testimony describes a different sequence, not dramatically different in every detail, but different in ways that matter. Some events that the official record places in a specific order appear in the testimony in a different arrangement. Some dates do not align. Some sequences that the official account presents as straightforward appear in the testimony as more complicated, with events overlapping or occurring in a different relationship to each other than the formal record suggests. These are not the kinds of differences that can be easily attributed to rounding or approximation. When a diary entry or a personal account places a significant event on one date and an official report places it on another. That is a factual disagreement. Both cannot be correct. One of them reflects what actually happened. The other reflects something else, whether a genuine error, a misremembering, or a deliberate adjustment to the sequence. And this is where the explanation becomes genuinely difficult. Timelines and expedition records were not produced casually. Dates mattered. Sequences mattered. They were the basis for calculating distances covered, resources consumed, and decisions made at specific points along the route. A timeline in an official polar expedition report was a carefully maintained record, not a rough approximation, which makes a meaningful discrepancy between the official timeline and the testimony's timeline, something that deserves more than a passing note. Some researchers suggest the timeline differences could reflect the different positions of the two accounts in the documentation process. The official report was compiled after the expedition ended, drawing on logs and notes maintained throughout the journey. The testimony was produced by a single individual whose record-keeping may not have been as systematic. Under this view, the official timeline is more reliable simply because it was built from more consistent documentation. That argument has some merit, but it also has a limit. The official timeline being built from more documents does not automatically make it accurate. If those documents were themselves produced with an awareness of how the record would eventually read, they may reflect a constructed version of the sequence rather than the straightforwardly observed one. The testimony, coming from someone without authority over the final record, may in some respects be less managed, more directly connected to what was actually experienced. Neither version has been proven false. That is an important point to hold on to. The inconsistencies identified through comparison do not, by themselves, establish that the official record is inaccurate and the testimony is correct. They establish that the two accounts conflict in specific ways. They raise the question of which version is more reliable at those specific points. But they do not answer that question on their own. What they do is make the question unavoidable. Before these comparisons are made carefully, it is possible to treat the official record as complete and the testimony as a marginal curiosity. After the comparisons are made, that position becomes harder to maintain because the specific nature of the inconsistencies, a described disagreement versus a described consensus, a different sequence of events versus the official sequence, cannot be explained away as the result of different perspectives on the same reality. Perspectives differ on interpretation. They do not typically differ on whether a decision was contested or unanimous. They do not typically produce meaningfully different sequences of specific dated events. The persistence of these inconsistencies across multiple sections of the two accounts is also worth noting. If the divergence appeared at only one point, it might be easier to attribute to a specific misremembering or a localized error. But the inconsistencies appear at different places, in different parts of both documents, involving different types of information. A contested decision in one section, a timeline discrepancy in another, other smaller differences distributed across the rest of the comparison. That pattern of distribution suggests something more systematic than an isolated error. What it suggests, though, is precisely where the current state of examination leaves the question open. Does a systematic pattern of inconsistency indicate that the official record was shaped in ways that departed from what actually happened? Or does it indicate that the testimony, produced by a single individual and not subject to the same documentation standards as the official report, accumulated errors and misrememberings at multiple points? Both possibilities exist. Neither has been definitively established. What can be said is that the inconsistencies are real, they are specific, and they are persistent. They appear in a comparison that has not been made publicly or formally in any sustained way. They involve categories of information, decision-making processes, and event sequences that are not trivial details in the context of polar expedition history, and they have not received an explanation that accounts for all of them in a satisfying way. That is the situation that a careful reading of both documents produces. Not a clear answer, but a clear set of questions. Questions about a decision that one account says was unanimous and another says was contested. Questions about a timeline that the two accounts arrange differently in ways that cannot both reflect what actually happened. Questions about what those specific differences mean for the accuracy of the official record that has been treated, for a very long time, as the reliable version of these events. Those questions do not resolve themselves simply by being identified. They require the kind of careful, sustained comparison that has not yet been done in any publicly available form. Until that comparison is made and its results are examined honestly, the inconsistencies will remain what they currently are: present, specific, persistent, and without a satisfying explanation. As the testimony continues beyond the earlier inconsistencies already identified, something shifts in the nature of the material. The discrepancies do not become fewer or less significant as the account progresses. They become more specific, more grounded in concrete detail, and in certain places, considerably more difficult to set aside with the kinds of general explanations that might account for simpler differences between two documents. This is worth noting carefully. When inconsistencies between accounts grow more specific as you move deeper into the material, it changes how they need to be evaluated. Vague differences can often be attributed to perspective, memory, or emphasis. Specific differences are harder to handle that way. Specificity implies observation. It implies that the person describing something was paying close attention to what they saw and recorded it with enough precision that the description can be compared meaningfully against other accounts of the same thing. And when a specific description conflicts with the specific claim in the official record, the distance between the two versions becomes harder to bridge. One of the most significant examples of this appears in the section of the testimony that deals with the supply cache. To understand why this matters, it helps to first understand what a supply cache represented in the context of a polar expedition. These were not incidental conveniences. They were carefully planned and positioned deposits of food, fuel, and equipment placed along a route in advance, specifically to support the team during the return journey. In polar conditions, where the margin between sufficient supplies and insufficient ones was often very narrow, caches were among the most critical elements of expedition planning and survival. The placement of a cache, its contents, and most importantly its condition when the team arrived to collect it were details of the highest practical importance. Expedition leaders knew this. The people responsible for documentation knew this. Supply caches appeared in expedition records not as afterthoughts, but as central data points. Their integrity was a matter of survival, and their status was something that any competent expedition account would address directly. This is what makes the discrepancy in this section of the testimony so difficult to explain through ordinary means. The official report describes the cache as intact when the team reached it. According to the formal record, the team arrived at the depot, found it in the expected condition, and was able to draw on its contents as planned. No problem is noted. No shortfall is mentioned. No concern about the cache's condition appears anywhere in the official documentation. The testimony describes something different. The witness does not say the cache was destroyed or completely missing. The description is more measured than that. It says the cache was not fully intact. Some items were missing. Some things had been disturbed. The condition was not what had been expected or what would have been needed for the return journey to proceed exactly as planned. The witness describes this with a level of detail that goes beyond a general impression of the situation. At first, it might seem possible to explain this through the idea that different team members accessed the cache at different times and observed it in different states. Perhaps the senior personnel who compiled the official report arrived when the cache was in better condition, and the witness arrived later when some items had already been used or moved. That explanation would account for a difference in what was observed without requiring either account to be inaccurate in its own terms. But there's a problem with that explanation. The testimony does not describe a cache that was partially used by the team itself. It describes a cache that arrived in a condition different from what was expected, with items missing and the depot disturbed in ways that were not the result of the team's own use of its contents. That is a meaningfully different situation, and it is one that the official record does not acknowledge at all. This is where the explanation becomes genuinely difficult. A supply cache that was not fully intact upon arrival would have been a significant logistical problem for the team. It would have required immediate assessment. It would have prompted decisions about how to proceed with reduced or different resources than planned. It would have been noted by expedition leadership as a factor affecting the return journey. The absence of any such note in the official record is not easy to account for. Oversights in documentation happen. That is a reasonable and honest acknowledgement. Records produced under difficult field conditions are not always complete. Details that seem important in retrospect may have been passed over in a moment. No expedition record is a perfect transcript of everything that occurred. That general truth has to be part of any fair evaluation of historical documents. But there are limits to how far the oversight argument can reasonably extend. A supply cache in polar conditions is not a peripheral detail that might understandably be overlooked in a busy or pressure documentation process. It is one of the most operationally significant elements of the entire return journey. Expedition leaders in this period were experienced enough to understand exactly what cache integrity meant for the safety and success of their teams. The idea that a problem with a critical supply depot would simply be forgotten or accidentally omitted from a formal report is not an easy position to maintain. Some researchers who have studied this discrepancy have suggested that it may point toward something more deliberate than an oversight. Under this interpretation, the cache's condition was known to expedition leadership and was consciously not included in the official record because acknowledging it would have raised questions about preparation, planning, or the management of expedition resources. A fully intact cache suggests things went according to plan. A partially compromised cache suggests they did not. And in the context of an officially submitted expedition report, the difference between those two pictures had real consequences for how the expedition would be evaluated. That interpretation is not provable from the available evidence. It is a reasonable inference based on the nature of the discrepancy and the context in which expedition records were produced. But it cannot be confirmed without access to information that does not currently exist in the public record. Others take a less pointed view. They suggest the difference between the two accounts may genuinely reflect different observations made by people in different positions within the team structure. Senior personnel may have assessed a cache against a different standard or with access to information that junior members did not have. What appeared to the witness as items missing may have been items that had been relocated according to a plan the witness was not aware of. This interpretation preserves the possibility that both accounts are honest, without requiring either to be fabricated or deliberately shaped. That explanation deserves consideration. It is possible, but it becomes harder to sustain when the testimony is read in detail. The witness does not describe confusion about the cache or uncertainty about what they were seeing. They describe specific observations about its condition with the kind of directness that suggests they understood what they were looking at. Someone familiar with polar expedition logistics, who had traveled with the team to that point, would have understood what the cache was supposed to contain and what its condition was supposed to be. The description in the testimony reads like the account of someone who recognized a discrepancy between expectation and reality, not someone who was uncertain about what they were observing. And this is precisely what makes specificity so important in evaluating this kind of discrepancy. A vague statement that the cache seemed different would be easier to explain away. A specific description of what was missing and what had been disturbed is a different category of claim. It is the kind of detail that a witness includes because they noticed it clearly, not because they are constructing a narrative. And specific details of that kind, when they conflict with specific claims in the official record, require a more precise accounting than general explanations about oversight or differing perspectives can provide. The question that the cache discrepancy leaves open is one that connects back to the earlier inconsistencies already identified. A pattern is developing across the testimony. The contested decision, the timeline differences, now the cache description. Each of these, taken alone, might be arguable in isolation. Taken together, they begin to form a picture of two accounts that differ not randomly, but in a consistent direction. The official record presents a smoother, more controlled version of events. The testimony introduces complications, conflicts, and problems at specific points where the official version is clearest and most coherent. That consistency of direction across multiple discrepancies is worth sitting with, because it raises a question that goes beyond any individual inconsistency. If the differences between the two accounts appeared randomly across the material, it would be easier to attribute them to the ordinary unreliability of memory and documentation. But if they appear consistently in the direction of the official record being smoother and less problematic than the testimony suggests, that pattern itself requires an explanation. Whether that explanation involves deliberate shaping of the record or something more structural about how authority over documentation operated within this expedition, or some other factor not yet identified, cannot be determined from the material currently available. What can be said is that the pattern exists. It is visible in the comparison, and the cache discrepancy is, at present, one of its most specific and difficult to dismiss examples. The testimony is specific about what was found at that depot. The official record is specific about what was found there. The two specifics do not match. In a document type, where supply cache integrity is one of the most operationally significant details that can be recorded, that mismatch does not have an obvious innocent explanation. It sits in the comparison, unresolved, just as the other inconsistencies sit there, waiting for an accounting that has not yet been provided. One of the things that makes this testimony difficult to set aside entirely is that it does not stand completely alone. That is an important observation. A single account from a single individual, however specific, and however clearly it contradicts the official record, carries a certain inherent limitation. It is one voice. It reflects one position within the expedition. It may contain errors, misrememberings, or gaps that a single source cannot correct for itself. That limitation is real, and it has to be honestly acknowledged when evaluating what the testimony is worth. But when you move beyond the testimony itself and look at the broader documentary record surrounding this expedition, something begins to shift. Not dramatically, not through the appearance of another formal account that directly contradicts the official report in the same way the testimony does, but through smaller things, fragments, private notes, letters that were never intended to be part of any official record, brief references in personal correspondence that touch on aspects of the expedition in ways that do not fully align with the picture the formal documentation presents. These fragments are scattered. They exist in different locations, personal archives, family collections, institutional holdings that were not specifically organized around this expedition. They were not produced with any coordinated purpose. The people who wrote them were not, as far as can be determined, in communication with each other about what they chose to say or not say. Each fragment stands on its own, produced independently, in different contexts, at different times after the expedition ended. And yet, when these fragments are placed alongside the testimony and compared against the official record, a quiet pattern emerges. Not a pattern of direct contradiction, more a pattern of quiet divergence. A consistent tendency, across multiple independent sources, to describe certain aspects of the expedition in ways that do not fully match the official version. The differences are not always the same. They do not all point to the same specific discrepancy, but they point in a similar direction, away from the smooth, controlled picture presented in the formal record, and toward something more complicated. One of the more significant fragments comes in the form of a letter. It was written by a junior member of the expedition shortly after returning. It was addressed to a family member, not to any institutional authority. It was a private communication, written in the kind of language people use when they are not constructing an official account, but simply describing their experience to someone they trust. That context matters. Private letters, written in the immediate aftermath of events, often capture things that more formal accounts do not. This letter describes the mood within the expedition team in terms that differ noticeably from the official record. The formal documentation presents the team as functioning cohesively, with difficulties managed through collective effort and shared purpose. The letter describes something more troubled. It references tension. It describes disagreements that the writer clearly found significant enough to mention, even in a private communication to a family member. It does not go into extensive detail about the nature of those disagreements, but it references them in a way that confirms they existed and that they affected the team's experience in ways the official record does not acknowledge. That detail sounds minor at first. People on long, difficult expeditions experience tension. Disagreements happen. The absence of those internal dynamics from an official report is not surprising and does not automatically indicate that the record was manipulated. Expedition reports were not required to be emotional diaries. They were formal accounts of operational events. Internal mood and interpersonal conflict were not always considered relevant to the formal documentation. But this is where the letter becomes more significant when placed alongside the testimony, because the testimony specifically describes a decision that was contested, a moment of real disagreement among team members that the official record presents as unanimous. The letter does not describe that specific decision, but it describes a team experiencing meaningful internal conflict that is not reflected anywhere in the formal documentation. That convergence between the testimony's account of a specific contested decision and the letter's description of a generally more troubled team dynamic is not a coincidence that can be easily dismissed. The letter does not prove the testimony is accurate. It is not strong enough on its own to do that, but it provides something important. It provides independent corroboration of the general picture the testimony presents, a picture in which the expedition's internal reality was more complicated than the official record suggests. And independent corroboration, even when it is partial and informal, changes the weight of a single account in a meaningful way. A second fragment adds another dimension to this emerging pattern. It was found in a personal archive, not a formal institutional collection. It is brief, more a note than a sustained account, and it touches on the supply situation described in the testimony. It does not describe the cache in the same detail the testimony does. It does not make the same specific claims, but it references the supply situation in terms that loosely align with the testimony's description of something not being as expected. It suggests, without stating directly, that the provision situation during the return was more difficult than the official record acknowledges. Again, this fragment alone is not definitive. A brief note in a personal archive, referencing a supply situation in general terms, is not the same as a detailed first-hand account. It could reflect misremembering. It could reflect second-hand information that the writer had not directly observed. The possibilities for innocent explanation are real. But the combination of this fragment with the testimony and the letter begins to produce something that individual pieces cannot produce on their own. A pattern. Multiple independent sources, none of them in formal communication with each other, none of them producing public challenges to the official record, all quietly describing aspects of the expedition that diverge from the formal version in consistent ways. That consistency across independent sources is harder to explain through coincidence or ordinary individual error. This is where the question of non-disclosure becomes important. None of the people whose fragments have been identified here chose to make their accounts public during their lifetimes. None of them formally challenged the official record. None of them submitted alternative testimonies to the relevant institutions or published their observations in any form that would have entered the historical debate. They wrote privately, spoke informally if at all, and left their divergent accounts in places where they were unlikely to be widely encountered. Why? That question does not have a simple answer. There are several possible explanations, and they are not mutually exclusive. One is practical. Challenging an official expedition record in this era was not a straightforward act. The institutions that produced and endorsed those records were powerful. The expedition leaders and senior members, whose accounts formed the basis of the official version, were often figures of significant public standing. Openly contradicting them carried social and professional risks that many junior members would have been reluctant to take. Another explanation is more personal. People who had been through difficult experiences sometimes chose to leave those experiences in the past. Speaking publicly about internal conflict, supply problems, or contested decisions would have meant revisiting things that may have been painful or complicated to address. The path of least resistance, for many people in that position, was simply not to speak. A third possibility, which some researchers have raised, is that the culture surrounding polar exploration in this period actively discouraged public dissent from official accounts. The expeditions were matters of national and institutional pride. The people who participated in them were expected to represent that pride in how they spoke about their experiences. Departing from the official version, even in subtle ways, may have felt like a violation of an unspoken obligation that most junior members were not willing to risk. Whatever the reasons, the result was a consistent pattern of private acknowledgement and public silence. People who had information that diverged from the official account kept that information in private spaces. It appeared in letters and notes that were not designed for public circulation, and it remained there, largely unexamined, until researchers looking carefully at the broader documentary record began to notice the quiet divergences it contained. That pattern of quiet non-disclosure is itself something that raises questions, not because silence is always suspicious. People choose not to speak publicly about difficult experiences for entirely understandable reasons, but because this particular silence operated consistently across multiple independent sources, all pointing in the same direction, over an extended period of time. That consistency suggests something more than individual reticence. It suggests a shared understanding, perhaps unspoken and never formally coordinated, that certain things about this expedition were better left out of public discussion. What those things were exactly, and why they were collectively treated as unsuitable for public record, is a question that the fragments themselves do not fully answer. The letter describes troubled team dynamics without specifying their cause. The archival note references supply difficulties without providing the kind of detail that would allow a clear picture to be assembled. The testimony provides more specificity than either of these, but even it does not constitute a complete account of everything that may have been withheld from the official record. What all of these sources together do provide is something important. They provide a basis for saying that the testimony is not simply the isolated account of one individual with a grievance or a particular perspective. They suggest that the alternative picture the testimony presents of a more troubled, more complicated expedition than the official record describes was a picture that more than one person recognized. More than one person experienced something that did not match the official story, and more than one person chose, for whatever reasons, not to say so publicly. That collective non-disclosure does not prove the official record is wrong. It does not confirm every claim the testimony makes, but it changes the context in which the testimony has to be evaluated. A single voice saying the official record is incomplete can be treated as an outlier. Multiple independent voices quietly pointing in the same direction, without coordination and without public declaration, is harder to reduce to an individual anomaly. It suggests something that was collectively known and collectively left unspoken, and that suggestion, even without final answers, is one that the historical record has not yet fully addressed. When a testimony raises questions about the accuracy of an official expedition record, the natural first response is to treat it as a contained historical problem, something specific to the expedition in question, a discrepancy between two accounts of one set of events, significant perhaps to specialists, but limited in its reach. That response is understandable, but it may not fully account for what is actually at stake when official polar records are found to be incomplete or selectively constructed. The reason the stakes extend further than they might initially appear has to do with how polar exploration records functioned historically. These were not simply personal accounts of individual journeys. They were the evidentiary basis for some of the most significant geographic and scientific claims of the early 20th century. Official reports established facts. They documented who reached specific locations. They recorded what was found, measured, and observed. They formed the foundation upon which priority claims were built. Claims about who was first, who documented what, and who deserved credit for specific discoveries and achievements. Priority claims in exploration history were not ceremonial. They had real consequences. They determined which nations received international recognition for geographic achievements. They shaped the careers and reputations of expedition leaders and their teams. They influenced how scientific findings were attributed and how they entered the broader record of human knowledge about the planet. A claim that rested on an official record was considered settled. It was treated as established fact, not subject to ongoing review. This is why the question of whether an official record is accurate matters beyond the personal story of any individual expedition. If the record upon which a priority claim rests contains inaccuracies, even selective ones, even in specific details rather than broad conclusions, then the claim itself rests on something less solid than it appears. That does not automatically mean the claim is wrong. A discovery that was genuinely made does not become unmade because the record of how it was made contains errors or omissions. But it does mean that the full picture of how the achievement was reached may not be what the historical record presents. And the full picture, it turns out, is often where the most significant historical information lives. The broad outcome of an expedition, whether a location was reached, whether a discovery was made, is often the less interesting part of the story. The decisions that led to that outcome, the conditions under which it was achieved, the internal dynamics of the team, the problems that were encountered, and how they were handled. These are the details that give an achievement its real historical texture. They are also the details that are most vulnerable to being managed, smoothed, or selectively omitted in official accounts produced under institutional pressure. If the testimony being examined here is accurate in its specific claims about a contested decision, about a different timeline, about the condition of a supply cache, then the official record of this expedition is presenting a cleaner version of events than what actually occurred. Not a fabricated version, necessarily. The broad outlines may be correct, but a version from which certain complications have been removed. And those complications, if they existed, were part of the real story of how this expedition unfolded. Their absence from the record means the record is incomplete in ways that matter. This is not a theoretical problem. It has occurred in documented cases involving other polar expeditions from the same period. There are historical instances where official accounts were later found to be partially inaccurate, and where that discovery changed how the expeditions in question were understood and evaluated. The changes were not always dramatic. The achievements were not erased. But the legacy of certain expeditions became more complicated once the gap between the official version and the actual experience of those involved was more fully understood. In some of those cases, the complication came from private letters or diaries that surfaced years after the expedition leaders and senior members had died. Documents that had been held in family collections or personal archives, not intended for public circulation, eventually became accessible to researchers. When those documents were compared against the official records, differences emerged, sometimes small ones, sometimes significant ones, and in each case, the historical picture became less clean and more human, more reflective of the difficulty, the conflict, and the uncertainty that accompanied the achievement being commemorated. The pattern in those cases is worth noting here because it provides context for the situation being examined. It suggests that the kind of gap this testimony points to, between an official version and the lived experience of those who were there, is not unusual. It is, in fact, a recognizable feature of how polar exploration history was documented and how it has been gradually revised as additional sources have become available. The testimony in question is not anomalous in pointing to this kind of gap. What is unusual is that the gap has not received the attention it might have, given the specificity of what the testimony contains. But this is where it becomes important to be precise about what the testimony does and does not imply. It does not suggest that the expedition's core achievements were invented or that the official record is false in its broad claims. What it suggests is something more specific and, in a way, more historically interesting. It suggests that the path to those achievements was different from how it was officially described, that the conditions were more difficult, the decisions more contested, and the situation more complicated than the formal documentation acknowledges. That kind of gap between a broadly correct outcome and a selectively described path to that outcome is exactly where historical understanding becomes uncertain, because history is not only a record of what was achieved, it is a record of how things happened. And how things happen determines what we understand about the people involved, the decisions they made, and the circumstances they navigated. When the how is incomplete or selectively presented, the understanding built on top of it is incomplete in corresponding ways. Some researchers who have worked with polar expedition records more broadly make a general observation that applies directly here. They note that official accounts of this era were often more concerned with establishing achievement than with documenting process. The goal of the formal record was to confirm that objectives were met and to present that confirmation in the most favorable light possible. The internal reality of how those objectives were approached, the disagreements, the miscalculations, the moments of genuine uncertainty, was considered secondary at best and inconvenient at worst. Under that framework, the specific details the testimony describes would not simply have been overlooked in the official record. They would have been understood as the kind of material that did not belong in a formal submission, not because anyone made a calculated decision to deceive, but because the purpose of the official record, as understood by those who produced it, was not to document internal process in full. It was to present outcomes and justify them. Everything else was, in a sense, considered outside the scope of what needed to be preserved. That framing helps explain how an official record can be both essentially honest in its broad claims and significantly incomplete in its specific details. It does not require bad faith or deliberate falsification. It requires only that the people responsible for the record were producing a document for a specific institutional purpose, and that purpose did not include preserving a complete account of everything that actually happened. But that explanation, while it helps account for how incomplete records were produced, does not resolve the historical problem they create. The historical problem remains. The record that was produced became the foundation for how the expedition is understood and evaluated. The material left out of that record, the contested decisions, the supply problems, the internal tensions, remained outside the historical account, preserved in fragments and private documents that have not been systematically examined or integrated into the picture. The result is a historical understanding that may be accurate in its conclusions, but incomplete in its basis. An achievement that may have been real, but whose full story has not been told. And a set of questions about what actually happened during this expedition that the official record, by its own limitations, cannot answer. This is the point at which the testimony's implications extend most clearly beyond the individual case. It is not simply asking whether one witness's account should be trusted over an official report. It is raising the broader question of whether the historical record of this expedition, which has informed how its achievements are understood, credited, and taught, reflects the full reality of what occurred, and if it does not, what that means for the claims and conclusions built upon it. Those are questions that historical research is equipped to examine. Careful comparison of sources, systematic review of the documentary record, honest evaluation of what the evidence supports and what it does not. These are standard tools of historical investigation. What has been missing in this case is not the methodology for examining the question. What has been missing is the sustained application of that methodology to the specific discrepancies the testimony presents. That gap in examination is itself part of the historical problem. An expedition record that may be incomplete in significant ways has continued to function as a complete and reliable foundation for how the expedition is understood. A testimony that raises specific questions about that record has continued to exist outside the mainstream historical discussion without formal engagement, and the gap between the official version and what the testimony suggests about the actual experience of those involved has remained exactly where it has always been, present, identifiable, and unresolved, waiting for the kind of careful, honest examination that the historical record has not yet provided. At this point in the examination, a reasonable question emerges. Given everything that has been identified, the specific inconsistencies, the contested decision, the cache discrepancy, the pattern of quiet corroboration from independent sources, what do researchers who have actually engaged with this material conclude? What explanations have been proposed? And how well do those explanations hold up against the evidence that is available? The answer, perhaps unsatisfyingly but honestly, is that no single explanation has emerged as the clear and accepted one. Several interpretations have been proposed over the years by different researchers approaching the material from different angles. They do not agree with each other, and none of them can be fully confirmed by the evidence that currently exists. That state of disagreement is itself significant. It is not the kind of disagreement that reflects a lack of serious engagement. It reflects a genuine difficulty in the material, a situation where the available evidence supports more than one reading, and where the information needed to choose definitively between them does not exist in accessible form. The first interpretation that has been proposed is the most direct one. Under this view, the testimony reflects genuine observations made by someone who was present, and those observations were deliberately excluded from the official record in order to protect the reputation of the expedition leadership. The discrepancies between the testimony and the official account are not the result of error or limited visibility. They represent a real alternative version of events, one that was known to those compiling the official report and consciously set aside because it introduced complications that the formal documentation was not meant to contain. This interpretation takes the testimony at face value. It treats the witness as a reliable observer whose account was accurate and whose exclusion from the official record was intentional. Under this reading, the official report was shaped, not fabricated wholesale, but shaped to present a version of events that served the interests of those with authority over the documentation process. The contested decision was recorded as unanimous because acknowledging the disagreement would have raised questions about leadership. The cash condition was described as intact because noting the problem would have invited scrutiny of expedition planning and preparation. That interpretation has a certain explanatory coherence. It accounts for the pattern of discrepancies. It fits within the documented broader context of how expedition records were managed during this period, and it is supported, at least partially, by the corroborating fragments from other sources that quietly point in the same direction as the testimony. But it also carries a significant limitation. Deliberate exclusion requires demonstrating intent, and intent, in a situation like this, is almost impossible to establish from documentary evidence alone. The absence of the testimony from the official record can be explained by deliberate choice. It can also be explained by other means. The interpretation is plausible. It is not provable. The second interpretation takes a different approach. It does not assume deliberate exclusion. Instead, it suggests that the inconsistencies in the testimony are the result of the witness having incomplete visibility into the full picture of events. Under this view, the testimony is entirely sincere. The witness described what they personally observed and experienced, but their position within the expedition gave them access to only part of what was happening. Senior personnel had information that junior members did not. Decisions were made and explained through channels that did not necessarily reach everyone. The supply cache situation may have been understood differently by those with full logistical information than by someone observing it from a junior position without access to all the relevant context. This interpretation is careful and reasonable. It preserves the honesty of the witness while accounting for the differences between the testimony and the official record without requiring anyone to have acted improperly. It is the kind of explanation that fits comfortably within what is known about how expedition hierarchies operated. Information did not flow equally to all members of a team. Different people had different levels of access to the full picture. What looked like a problem to one person might have had an explanation that another person simply was not aware of. But there's a problem with applying this interpretation too broadly. It works reasonably well for certain kinds of discrepancies. It explains why a junior member might have had an incomplete picture of some things. It does not explain as easily why a junior member would describe a specific decision as contested when it was actually unanimous, or describe a specific supply cache condition in detail when the actual condition was entirely different. Those are not the kinds of discrepancies that typically result from limited access to information. They are the kinds of discrepancies that result from different things actually being observed. And that distinction matters when evaluating how far the incomplete visibility explanation can reasonably extend. The third interpretation shifts the focus away from what happened during the expedition and toward what happened afterward. It centers on the passage of time and the unreliability of memory as an explanation for the discrepancies. The testimony was not produced immediately after the events it describes. It was recorded some time after the expedition ended, and in the interval between the events and the recording of the account, memory does what memory always does. It shifts. Details that felt clear at the time become less precise. Sequences that were experienced in one order may be recalled in a slightly different order. Impressions that were strong in the moment may harden into convictions about specific facts that the original experience may not fully support. This interpretation is grounded in well-established understanding of how human memory works. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. Every time a memory is recalled, it is rebuilt from available information, and that rebuilding process introduces the possibility of distortion. This is not a character flaw in the witness. It is a basic feature of how memory functions in all human beings, and it means that a testimony produced some time after events occurred may contain distortions that accumulated gradually and sincerely, without the witness being aware of them. That explanation has genuine merit. However, it runs into the same difficulty that limits the incomplete visibility interpretation. The discrepancies in this testimony are specific. They are not the kind of general impressionistic differences that typically result from ordinary memory drift over time. A person misremembering the general atmosphere of an expedition is understandable. A person describing a specific decision as contested when it was unanimous, or describing specific missing items from a supply cache, is making claims that have a different character. Specific detailed claims of that kind are more resistant to the memory drift explanation than general impressions are. The fourth interpretation is the least commonly held of the four, but it is arguably the most nuanced. It suggests that neither the testimony nor the official record should be treated as the single correct account of what happened. Instead, both documents are understood as selectively accurate, each one reflecting the genuine perspective of a different role and experience within the same expedition. Under this view, it is possible for the official record to accurately reflect the experience and understanding of senior expedition personnel, while the testimony accurately reflects the experience and understanding of a junior member. The two accounts are not competing versions of the same objective reality. They are complementary, but partial views of a shared experience that was genuinely different for different people within it. This interpretation has an appealing quality. It avoids requiring either account to be wrong. It acknowledges that large, complex expeditions are experienced differently by people in different positions. What felt like a unanimous decision to expedition leadership may have felt like an imposed decision to someone who observed it from a junior position. What appeared as a fully intact cache to those with complete logistical knowledge may have appeared differently to someone whose information was more limited. Both experiences could be real without either being a complete account of an objective truth. But this interpretation also has a limit that its nuance cannot fully overcome. It works well for differences of perception and experience. It does not work as well for differences of fact. Two people can genuinely experience the same event differently. They cannot both be accurately describing a single factual condition, the presence or absence of specific items in a supply cache, for example, if their descriptions are incompatible. At some point, selective accuracy becomes a careful way of avoiding the acknowledgement that at least one account contains something that does not correspond to what actually happened. What is notable about these four interpretations, taken together, is that each one illuminates something real about the situation. The first captures the documented pattern of expedition records being managed under institutional pressure. The second captures the genuine limitations of junior members' access to full information. The third captures the real and well-understood unreliability of memory over time. The fourth captures the genuine complexity of shared experience within a hierarchical team structure. None of them is simply wrong. Each one addresses a real aspect of the problem, and yet none of them resolves it. That is the honest position that the available evidence produces. Each interpretation has supporting material. Each also has material that complicates it. The researchers who have engaged most carefully with this testimony have not converged on a single explanation. They have identified the same range of possibilities and found themselves unable, on the basis of what is currently available, to determine which one best accounts for all the evidence. That ongoing disagreement among careful researchers is itself an important piece of information. It does not mean the question is unanswerable. It means the question has not yet been answered. The distinction matters. An unanswerable question is one where the necessary evidence cannot, in principle, exist. An unanswered question is one where the necessary evidence may exist, but has not yet been found, examined, or placed in productive relationship with what is already known. The question raised by this testimony appears to be the second kind. The material that would allow a more definitive evaluation may exist in archives that have not been fully examined, in documents that have not been compared systematically, in sources that researchers have noted but not pursued. The disagreement among those who have engaged with the testimony so far may reflect the limits of what has been examined rather than the limits of what could be known. That possibility keeps the question genuinely open, not open in the casual sense of simply unresolved, open in the more precise sense of requiring further investigation before any of the proposed interpretations can be fairly confirmed or dismissed. And that requirement for further investigation, which the current state of research has not yet met, is where the examination of this testimony currently stands. After everything that has been examined, the specific inconsistencies, the contested decision, the supply-cache discrepancy, the corroborating fragments, the range of interpretations that researchers have proposed without reaching agreement, one thing can be stated with reasonable confidence. The situation has not been resolved. The gap between the official record and the testimony remains exactly where it has always been, present, identifiable, and without a satisfying explanation. Time has passed, but the central questions have not been answered. That absence of resolution is itself worth stating clearly, because it is easy for unresolved historical questions to gradually take on the appearance of settled ones. When a question is not actively discussed, when it does not appear in mainstream historical accounts, when it is not the subject of ongoing public debate, it can begin to seem as though it has been addressed, as though the silence around it reflects conclusion rather than avoidance. That impression is misleading in this case. The questions raised by this testimony have not been answered. They have simply not been asked loudly enough, or often enough, to force an answer. The first of those questions is the most basic one. Why was this account excluded from the official submission? That question has been present from the beginning of this examination, and it has not been satisfactorily resolved by any of the explanations that have been proposed. The procedural explanation, that junior accounts were routinely left out of formal documentation, does not account for the fact that this account contains specific factual claims that contradict the official record. The selective accuracy explanation, that different roles produced different genuine experiences, does not account for incompatible descriptions of specific observable conditions. And the deliberate exclusion explanation, while consistent with the evidence, cannot be confirmed from what is currently available. What remains is a question without a documented answer. The official record does not explain the absence. The archives do not contain a note indicating the testimony was reviewed and set aside. There is no paper trail showing how the decision was made to exclude this account, or whether that decision was consciously made at all. The absence is simply there, undocumented and unexplained, in a record that has been treated as complete for a very long time. The second question follows from the first. Why do specific details in the testimony contradict the formal record in ways that go beyond what simple memory differences or positional limitations can account for? This question matters because the nature of the discrepancies has been examined carefully throughout this investigation, and certain of them resist the ordinary explanations that are usually applied to divergences between personal accounts and official documentation. A contested decision described as unanimous. A supply cache condition described in incompatible terms by two sources with direct relevance to the expedition's return. A timeline that arranges specific events in a different order than the official record presents. These are not the kinds of differences that fade easily into the background of ordinary historical variation. They are specific enough to require specific accounting, and that specific accounting has not been provided. The discrepancies have been identified by the small number of researchers who have engaged carefully with the material. They have been noted, but the process of formally working through each point of conflict, evaluating the competing claims against all available evidence, and arriving at a documented conclusion about which account is more reliable at each specific point, that process has not been completed in any publicly available form. The discrepancies remain in the same state they have occupied since the comparison was first made. Noted but unresolved. The third question concerns the corroborating fragments. Why do accounts from other expedition members, in private letters, in personal notes, in brief archival references, quietly echo parts of what the testimony describes, without any of those individuals ever formally challenging the official record? This question points to something that goes beyond the testimony itself. It suggests that the alternative picture the testimony presents was not unique to one individual's experience. It was shared, in various degrees and in various forms, by others who were present, and yet none of those others chose to make their observations part of any formal or public challenge to the official account. That collective silence is one of the more difficult aspects of this case to explain simply. Individual reticence is understandable. The social and professional risks of challenging an official expedition record were real. The cultural expectation that expedition members would support rather than complicate the official story was genuine. Any one person's decision not to speak publicly about what they observed can be accounted for through those factors. But the consistency of that decision across multiple independent individuals, each in different circumstances, each leaving behind only quiet, private traces of a different picture, that consistency raises questions that individual explanations do not fully address. It is also worth noting what this collective non-disclosure means for the historical record. The official account was not simply the product of one person's perspective given authority over the documentation process. It was, in effect, sustained by the silence of everyone else who held information that might have complicated it. That silence may have been chosen for understandable reasons, but its effect was to leave the official version unchallenged in public, while an alternative understanding of events existed privately among multiple people who had been there. That gap between private knowledge and public record is one of the places where historical accuracy most often fails. The fourth question is perhaps the most uncomfortable one to sit with. Why has this testimony remained at the edges of historical discussion rather than at its center? Given the specificity of its claims, given the corroborating material that exists in the broader documentary record, given the clear and identifiable nature of the discrepancies it presents with the official account, why has sustained, formal engagement with this testimony not occurred in any way that has entered the mainstream historical literature? That question does not have a clean answer. Some of it may reflect the practical realities of historical research. Archives are large. Resources are limited. Not every anomaly receives the sustained attention it might deserve, simply because attention is a finite resource distributed unevenly across the historical field. Some discrepancies that deserve examination remain unexamined for reasons that have nothing to do with their significance and everything to do with the logistics of research. But there's also something else worth considering. Established historical narratives have a kind of institutional momentum. Once a version of events has been accepted, published, referenced, and built upon, challenging it requires not just evidence, but a sustained effort to redirect attention that has already settled elsewhere. The official record of this expedition has been in place for a long time. It has been treated as reliable. Challenging it, even with specific and identifiable evidence, requires making the case that the established narrative deserves reconsideration. That case takes effort to make and may encounter resistance from those who have a professional investment in the existing account. This is not a claim that anything improper has occurred in how this testimony has been treated by the historical community. It is simply an observation about how institutional narratives function and how difficult it can be to introduce material that complicates them, regardless of how specific or well-supported that material is. The testimony has not been suppressed in any active or deliberate sense in recent decades. It has simply not been made central. And the difference between active suppression and institutional inertia, while real, does not change the practical outcome. The testimony remains outside the mainstream account. Some people, examining everything laid out in this investigation, will reach one conclusion. They will look at the official record, with its institutional backing and its long history of acceptance, and conclude that it is essentially correct. They will treat the testimony as an outlier, the account of one individual whose observations, for whatever reason, do not reliably reflect what actually occurred. They will explain the discrepancies through memory, limited visibility, or ordinary variation between accounts, and they will find the official story, despite its limitations, more trustworthy than an excluded testimony whose relationship to the formal record has never been formally resolved. That conclusion is available. It cannot be ruled out with the evidence that exists. The official record may be essentially accurate, and the testimony may contain errors or distortions that make it an unreliable guide to the specific points where it conflicts with the formal account. That possibility has to remain on the table. Others will look at the same material and see something different. They will see a witness whose account is specific, detailed, and consistent with corroborating fragments from independent sources. They will see a pattern of discrepancies that points consistently in one direction. They will see an official record produced under institutional conditions that are well documented to have shaped how expedition histories were told. And they will conclude that the testimony represents a real alternative account of events, one that was inconvenient to those controlling the official record and was therefore excluded from it, leaving the historical understanding of this expedition incomplete in ways that have never been honestly addressed. That conclusion is also available. It is also consistent with significant portions of the available evidence, and it also cannot be fully confirmed without material that does not currently exist in accessible form. The full documentary record of this expedition, if it ever existed in complete form, may no longer be intact. Documents from this period were not always carefully preserved. Some were lost. Some were misplaced in large institutional archives where they have not been located or cataloged in accessible ways. Some may have been deliberately removed from collections, though that claim cannot be made confidently without evidence. What can be said is that the archive, as it currently stands, does not provide everything that would be needed to resolve the questions this testimony raises. Some of what would be needed may simply no longer exist. What does exist is the testimony itself. It sits in the record, outside the official account, specific in its claims and unaddressed in its contradictions. It is the account of someone who was present, someone who described specific events in ways that conflict with the formal documentation at identifiable points. Someone whose voice was not included in the official submission and whose exclusion has never been explained. Whether that voice changes anything about how this expedition is understood depends on something that no document can determine on its own. It depends on the willingness of those who engage with this history to treat the gap between the official record and the testimony as a genuine historical problem, one that deserves the same careful, sustained attention that the official account has always received. It depends on whether the questions raised here are treated as questions worth answering, rather than as complications better left at the edges of a story that has already been told. That gap between the official version and what the testimony suggests about the actual experience of those who were there has remained open for a long time. It remains open now, and the testimony, patient and specific, continues to ask the question that the official record has never answered. Not loudly, but clearly enough for those willing to read it carefully and take seriously what it says. 4:14 p.m. After everything that has been examined throughout this investigation, one thing stands out with particular clarity. Not an answer, not a resolution, but the very absence of both. The official record exists in its established form. The testimony exists in its excluded form. The gap between them exists in its unexamined form. And after all the time that has passed since these events occurred, since the official report was submitted and accepted, since the testimony was quietly set aside without explanation, that gap remains exactly where it has always been, unaddressed, unexplained, and in certain respects, deliberately avoided. That observation deserves to be stated plainly before anything else, because one of the things that makes this case genuinely unusual is not simply that a discrepancy exists between two accounts. Discrepancies of that kind are common in historical records. They appear regularly when official documentation is compared against personal accounts, private correspondence, or informal testimony. That alone would not make this case particularly notable. What makes it notable is the combination of factors that surround this specific discrepancy: the specificity of the testimony's claims, the nature of the corroborating material from independent sources, the complete absence of any formal engagement with the contradiction, and the length of time over which that absence has persisted without being addressed or even widely acknowledged. Each of those factors, taken alone, might be explainable. Together, they form a situation that does not resolve itself through ordinary historical accounting. And that situation, a testimony sitting outside the official record, specific in its contradictions, corroborated in quiet ways by independent sources, and formally unaddressed for an extended period, is where this examination finds itself after working carefully through everything the available material contains. The questions that remain are not peripheral ones. They are not minor historical curiosities that sit at the edge of a story that is otherwise well understood. They are questions about the reliability of the foundational record itself. The first of those questions concerns the exclusion. Why was this account not included in the official submission? No explanation has been found in the available documentation. No note records a decision to exclude it. No reference acknowledges that it existed and was considered and set aside. The absence of the testimony from the official record is itself undocumented. and an undocumented exclusion of a witness account that contradicts the official version on specific factual points is not something that can be comfortably explained away as a routine procedural gap. The second question concerns the nature of the discrepancies themselves. Why do specific details in the testimony conflict with specific claims in the official record in ways that go beyond what ordinary memory differences or positional limitations can account for? A contested decision described as unanimous. A supply cache condition described incompatibly by two accounts that both claim directness. A sequence of events arranged differently in the testimony than in the official timeline. These are not differences of tone or impression. They are differences of stated fact. And differences of stated fact between a witness account and an official record at specific and identifiable points require specific and identifiable explanations. Those explanations have not been provided. The third question concerns the broader pattern of corroboration. Why do private letters, personal notes, and archival fragments from other expedition members quietly echo aspects of what the testimony describes, without any of those individuals ever formally challenging the official account? That pattern of quiet private acknowledgement combined with public silence is one of the more difficult aspects of this case to account for through simple explanations. Individual reticence is understandable, but consistent individual reticence across multiple independent people, each leaving behind only private traces of a different picture of the same events, suggests something more than coincidence. It suggests a shared understanding that certain things about this expedition were better left out of public discussion. What those things were, and why they were treated that way, remains unclear. The fourth question is perhaps the one that most directly affects how this case should be understood going forward. Why has this testimony remained outside the mainstream historical discussion of this expedition, given its specificity, given its corroboration, given the clear and identifiable nature of its contradictions with the official account? The fact that sustained formal engagement with this material has not occurred in any publicly available form is itself something that requires an honest accounting. Historical research has limited resources and cannot pursue every anomaly with equal attention. That is true and fair, but it does not fully explain why a testimony this specific, with corroborating material this identifiable, has not generated the kind of careful comparative analysis that the situation seems to call for. Some people will examine all of this and reach one conclusion. They will look at the official record and treat its long history of acceptance as evidence of its essential reliability. They will account for the testimony's discrepancies through the available explanations, memory drift, limited visibility, positional differences within the expedition hierarchy, and find those explanations sufficient. They will regard the corroborating fragments as too indirect and too fragmentary to meaningfully support the testimony's alternative picture. And they will conclude that the official story, for all its acknowledged limitations as a historical document, remains more trustworthy than an excluded account whose relationship to the formal record has never been formally examined. That conclusion is genuinely available. It is not an unreasonable position. The official record carries real evidentiary weight. It was produced by people with direct access to the full documentation of the expedition. It was reviewed and accepted by the relevant authorities. It has informed historical understanding for a long time without being formally challenged by anyone with the resources and access to conduct a sustained examination of its claims. All of that counts for something, and the testimony, for all its specificity, remains a single excluded account that has not been subjected to the same level of institutional scrutiny as the official report. Others will look at exactly the same material and reach a different conclusion. They will see a witness whose account is specific, internally consistent, and quietly supported by independent sources. They will see an official record produced under conditions that are well documented to have encouraged the management of expedition narratives toward favorable outcomes. They will see a pattern of discrepancies that points consistently in one direction, toward the official record being smoother, cleaner, and less complicated than the actual experience of those present. And they will conclude that the testimony represents a real and suppressed alternative account of events that was excluded because it introduced complications the official record was not designed to accommodate. That conclusion is also available. It is also consistent with significant portions of the evidence. the documented pattern of expedition record management during this period, the specific and detailed nature of the testimony's contradictions, the corroborating fragments that independently suggest a more troubled expedition than the official version presents, the complete absence of any documented explanation for the testimony's exclusion. Taken together, these factors provide a reasonable basis for the interpretation that something in the official record was deliberately shaped, and that the testimony preserves a version of events that was considered inconvenient. The archive, as it currently stands, is incomplete. That is not a dramatic claim. It is simply an acknowledgement of how historical documentation works over time. Documents are lost. Collections are incompletely cataloged. Materials held in private hands or small institutional archives are not always accessible to researchers working on related questions. The gap in the available record is real, and it directly limits what can be concluded about the gap between the official account and the testimony. What does remain, fully and specifically, is the testimony itself. It has not been lost. It exists in a form that can be read and compared against the official record. Its claims are identifiable. Its contradictions with the formal documentation are locatable at specific points in both documents, and its relationship to the corroborating fragments from other sources is traceable. Even if those fragments are incomplete and indirect, that testimony has waited a long time for the kind of careful, sustained, formal engagement that its specificity seems to warrant. It has sat outside the official account, neither confirmed nor definitively refuted, neither formally integrated into the historical discussion nor formally dismissed from it. It occupies an uncertain space in the record, present enough to be found by those who look carefully, marginal enough to have been overlooked by the mainstream historical discussion that shapes how this expedition is understood and taught. Whether that changes depends on something no document can determine on its own. It depends on whether the people who engage with this history are willing to treat the gap between the official record and the testimony as a genuine historical problem, deserving genuine historical investigation, not as a settled question that has already been adequately addressed, not as a marginal curiosity that sits too far outside the established narrative to be worth pursuing, but as an open question, specific, corroborated, and unresolved, that the historical record has an obligation to examine honestly. The official story has had its hearing. It has been repeated, referenced, accepted, and built upon for a long time. The testimony has not had an equivalent hearing. It has existed in the margins, specific in its claims and patient in its waiting. Whether it ever receives the formal examination it has not yet received is a question that remains genuinely open in its own way, as every other question this testimony has raised and left unanswered. The gap is still there. The testimony is still there, and the silence that has surrounded both of them for so long has not yet been adequately explained. 10 KO extant Crow. For 17 p.m. The questions that this testimony leaves behind do not diminish with time. They accumulate. Each time the official record is consulted without the testimony being placed alongside it, the gap widens in a practical sense, not because new information has been lost, but because the habit of treating the official account as complete becomes more deeply established with every passing year. And habits of that kind, in historical understanding, are among the most difficult things to correct once they have settled into place. This is worth examining carefully, because there's a difference between a historical question that has been considered and set aside, and a historical question that has simply never been fully considered at all. The first situation, whatever its outcome, reflects a process. Someone looked at the material. Someone made a judgment. Someone left a record of that engagement, even if the conclusion was that the question did not warrant further pursuit. That process, however imperfect, is how historical understanding is supposed to work. The second situation is different. It reflects not a judgment but an absence of judgment, a question that was never formally posed, never systematically examined, never brought to the kind of sustained analytical attention that its specific content seems to require. The testimony being examined here appears to fall into the second category. The absence surrounding it is not the absence that follows from careful consideration and deliberate conclusion. It is the absence that precedes consideration. The question of what this testimony means for the accuracy of the official record has not been answered. It has not been seriously asked in any formal or sustained public way. And that distinction between an answered question and an unasked one matters considerably for how the current state of the historical record should be understood. Whether that request is honored depends on choices that have not yet been made, choices about which historical questions deserve sustained attention, choices about how established narratives should be treated when specific, corroborated material exists that complicates them, choices about whose voices are considered worth recovering from the margins of the historical record and placing in honest relationship with the accounts that have always occupied its center. The testimony remains where it has always been, outside the official story, specific in what it says, unresolved in what it means, and still waiting, after all this time, for the kind of careful and honest engagement that the questions it raises have always deserved.